I grew up invisible in my own home, an afterthought in my father's second marriage. So when my stepmother passed away, decades after I'd walked out of her life for good, no one was more shocked than I was to learn what she had left behind for me. My name is Anna. I was 38 years old, sitting at my own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when a phone call arrived that would unravel everything. I thought I understood about my past. When the lawyer's voice came through the line, calm and deliberate, I assumed it was a mistake, a wrong number, some kind of scam. What I didn't expect was to walk out of a law office 1 week later as the sole heir to a $3 million house that didn't even feel like it belonged to me. But before I tell you about the inheritance that reopened wounds I thought had healed decades ago, I need to take you back to the moment my life first split cleanly in two. The day everything familiar disappeared, and a woman named Helen walked in to take its place. I was 10 years old when my mother died. One day she was humming in the kitchen, stirring her famous chicken soup, filling our small house with warmth and the smell of onions and thyme. The next day, she was gone, taken suddenly by an illness that moved through her life and mine, like a thief who gave no warning. I don't remember much about the weeks that followed. Grief, at that age, doesn't arrive in clear memories. It arrives in fragments, the smell of casseroles brought by well-meaning neighbors, the sound of my father crying quietly behind a closed bathroom door, the strange, hollow silence of a house that used to be full of noise. My father and I ate our dinners in silence after that, clinging to each other the way survivors of a shipwreck cling to whatever floats. 2 years later, he remarried. Her name was Helen. To outsiders, she was elegance personified: immaculate hair, tailored suits, a faint trace of expensive perfume that seemed to arrive in a room several seconds before she did. To me, though, from the very first night, she was something else entirely. She was a wall. I remember the first evening she came into our home, carrying 3 children of her own: Lizzie, the oldest, sharp-eyed and quick to judge; Emily, the middle child, restless and easily bored; and Jonathan, the youngest, quiet in a way that somehow still felt territorial, like a small animal marking ground it had already decided belonged to him. They moved through our house that first night the way a new family moves into unfamiliar territory, cautiously at first, then quickly, confidently, claiming rooms and corners as their own. "This is Anna?" my father said, resting a proud, nervous hand on my shoulder. "My daughter." Lizzie looked me up and down slowly, the way you might examine something you're deciding whether to keep. Her lip curled into a small, careless smirk. "She's quiet. She's shy," Helen corrected quickly, offering a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then she leaned toward me, her voice light, almost playful, though something beneath it already felt dismissive. "You'll get along with my children just fine, won't you? If you try." I nodded. I didn't have words yet for what I was feeling, but somewhere deep in my 10-year-old chest, a quiet, certain understanding had already settled in. I was an outsider in my own home. From that day forward, our household reorganized itself around Helen's children, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way water reshapes stone over years rather than days. Dinners became a stage where I had no lines. Conversation revolved around Lizzie's piano recitals, Emily's growing collection of trophies, Jonathan's report cards, each achievement celebrated loudly, enthusiastically, while I sat quietly at the edge of the table, present but somehow unseen. I don't believe Helen ever intended overt cruelty, at least not in those early years. It was something subtler, something harder to name or confront directly: a slow, persistent exclusion built from 1,000 small moments, rather than any single dramatic act. I wasn't included in family photographs unless someone specifically remembered to call me over. I wasn't asked about my school day unless I volunteered the information first, unprompted. When report cards arrived, mine were acknowledged with a brief, polite nod while Lizzie's, Emily's, and Jonathan's were celebrated with genuine warmth and pride. My father tried, in his own limited way, to bridge this quiet distance. He'd occasionally pull me aside for a private dinner, just the two of us, or sneak me an extra dessert with a conspiratorial wink. But he was grieving too, in his own way, and increasingly absorbed into building a new life with Helen, a life that seemed to have less and less room for the daughter who reminded him, perhaps too painfully, of the wife he'd lost. I don't say any of this with bitterness now. I understand, as an adult, how grief and new love can tangle together in ways that leave everyone a little lost. But as a child, none of that context existed for me. All I understood was the growing, hollow feeling of being unwanted in my own home. By the time I reached my teenage years, the pattern had solidified into something I no longer questioned. I simply understood. With the quiet resignation children develop toward unchangeable circumstances, that I existed on the periphery of my own family. Helen wasn't cruel in any way that would have alarmed outside observers. She fed me, clothed me, ensured I attended school, and appeared presentable at family gatherings. To anyone watching from a distance, she likely appeared to be a devoted stepmother, raising 4 children under one roof with reasonable fairness. But fairness, I learned, isn't only about material provision, it's about attention, about warmth, about the countless small moments where a child needs to feel genuinely seen, rather than simply accounted for. I remember one particular evening, when I was 14, that captured this dynamic perfectly. I had worked for weeks on a school science project, staying up late refining every detail, hoping desperately for some recognition from the family I still, despite everything, wanted so badly to belong to. When I brought home a first-place ribbon from the regional science fair, I rushed through the front door, breathless with excitement, ready to share the news. Helen was in the kitchen, helping Lizzie prepare for an upcoming piano recital. "That's wonderful, Anna," she said, barely glancing up from adjusting Lizzie's sheet music. "We're just finishing up here. Can you set the table, please?" I stood there for a moment, ribbon still in hand, waiting for something more. It never came. I set the table quietly that evening, the ribbon tucked into my backpack. Unmentioned again for the remainder of the night. My father passed away when I was 17, a sudden cardiac event that left our already fragile family dynamic even more precarious. His death, in many ways, severed the last remaining thread that had ever truly connected me to that household. Helen, to her credit, didn't force me out immediately. I finished my final year of high school still living under her roof, though the distance between us, already substantial, grew even more pronounced without my father present, to occasionally bridge the gap. I turned 18 quietly, without celebration, in a house that had never fully felt like home. Within weeks of graduating, I packed a single suitcase, said a brief, formal goodbye to Helen and her children, and left for good. I can't do this anymore, I whispered to myself as I zipped that suitcase closed, tears streaming silently down my face. Leaving meant severing ties not just with Helen, but with the entire painful chapter of my childhood, the piano recitals I was never invited to celebrate, the report cards acknowledged with polite indifference, the ribbon that was never truly seen. I built a life for myself after that, slowly, carefully. Brick by brick, I put myself through college, working nights and weekends to cover tuition. I found a career I genuinely cared about. I met my husband, a kind, steady man who saw me clearly and completely, in ways my childhood household never had. I never imagined I'd hear Helen's name again. I certainly never imagined the way I would eventually hear it. Nearly 20 years passed after I walked out of that house for the final time. By 38, I had rebuilt myself into someone almost unrecognizable from the lonely, overlooked teenager who once slipped quietly out the door without a backward glance. I had a husband who adored me completely, a career that grounded me, a home that finally, genuinely felt safe. The ghosts of my childhood rarely visited anymore. I had made peace, or something close enough to peace, with the quiet exclusion I'd experienced. I didn't think about Helen often. When I did, it was with a kind of distant, muted sadness rather than active pain. That particular evening began like any other. I dragged myself home from work, exhausted, my heels landing with a tired thud by the front door. I reheated leftovers with the practiced resignation of someone who'd had a long day, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down at my kitchen table, grateful simply for the quiet. That's when my phone buzzed against the wood. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring through to voicemail. A bill collector, perhaps, a wrong number, but something instinct, maybe, or simple restless curiosity made me swipe to answer. Hello. Is this Anna? The voice was calm, measured, unmistakably professional. Yes, I said slowly, uncertain. My name is Mr. Adams. I'm an attorney. I represent your stepmother, Helen. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. My throat tightened instantly. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades, and suddenly it sounded almost like a ghost had whispered it directly into my kitchen. Helen. My voice cracked slightly on the word. Les. He continued, his tone gentle but professional. I'm very sorry to inform you that Helen has passed away. I need you to attend the reading of her will. The air in my kitchen seemed to shift, the silence pressing in more tightly around me. My mind raced through a dozen confused questions at once. I haven't spoken to Helen in decades. I blurted out, my voice unsteady. I don't understand. Why would you be calling me? I'm not able to discuss the details over the phone. Mr. Adams replied carefully. But your presence is required. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. Every protective instinct urged me to simply decline. To protect the peaceful, hard-won life I'd built far away from that painful chapter of my past. But curiosity, insistent, nagging, impossible to ignore, wrapped itself firmly around me. After a long, uncertain pause, I finally whispered, All right, I'll come. Good, Mr. Adams said softly, something almost knowing in his tone. You might be surprised at what Helen left behind. I hung up the phone and sat motionless at my kitchen table for a long time afterward. My dinner growing cold in front of me, my mind spinning through fragments of memory. I hadn't revisited in years Helen's polite, distant smile, Lizzie's careless smirk, the science fair ribbon tucked unnoticed into my backpack. Why me? I wondered. Why now, after all these years of silence? I had no idea, sitting there that evening, exactly how profoundly that single phone call was about to reshape everything I thought I understood about my past. The following week, I gripped my steering wheel so tightly during the drive to Mr. Adams' office that my knuckles turned pale. The city traffic blurred past me, though my mind wasn't truly present in the moment. It hovered instead somewhere between dread and disbelief, circling the same unanswered question again and again. Why had Helen's lawyer called me, of all people? The law office loomed ahead eventually, an old brick building with tall windows and brass handles polished to a gleaming shine. I parked at the curb and sat there for several long moments, my engine ticking quietly as it cooled, my reflection in the rearview mirror looking pale and visibly nervous. You can do this, I whispered to myself, though I wasn't entirely certain I believed it. When I finally stepped inside, I was greeted by the faint smell of polished wood and expensive cologne. A receptionist led me down a carpeted hallway into a formal conference room. And there they were. Lizzie noticed me first, her arms crossed tightly, her expression sharp and immediately suspicious. Emily didn't bother looking up right away, her thumbs moving rapidly across her phone screen, jaw working a piece of gum like a small, steady drumbeat of defiance. Jonathan muttered something under his breath. As I entered, I caught only fragments. Something like, unbelievable, and, The air in that room felt thick, almost suffocating. I slid quietly into a chair at the far end of the mahogany table, deliberately keeping distance between myself and Helen's children. No greetings passed between us. No pleasantries. Not even simple curiosity about why we'd all been gathered together. I was still, clearly, the intruder, the extra piece that had never quite fit. A moment later, the door opened again. Mr. Adams entered, a leather folder tucked under his arm. His glasses catching the fluorescent light overhead. He cleared his throat gently, his voice calm and professional. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here today to read the last will and testament of Helen." The room stilled instantly. Even Emily lowered her phone, if only for a brief moment. Mr. Adams opened the folder carefully, adjusting his glasses. His voice remained measured, though each word that followed landed like a small thunderclap. "To my stepdaughter, Anna," he read, "I leave my residence on Williams Street, valued at approximately $3 million. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. No one in that room breathed. Then, almost instantly, chaos erupted. Lizzie shot to her feet, her chair screeching backward violently against the floor. "What?" "That's ridiculous," she screamed, her face flushing an angry, blotchy red. "She must have forged something. There's no way." Jonathan leaned forward across the table, his fists clenched tightly. "Why would Mom leave you anything? You weren't even really family to her. This has to be some kind of scam." Emily tossed her phone onto the table so forcefully, it rattled loudly against the wood. "Oh, please. This reeks of manipulation." "What exactly did you do, Anna?" Sneak in and twist her mind when nobody was looking. Their words stung sharply, though I found myself unable to respond. My throat felt like sandpaper, my mind still struggling to process the sheer, overwhelming shock of what I'd just heard. Mr. Adams raised his hand firmly, commanding the room back into an uneasy, brittle silence. "Please," he said calmly. "Let me finish." He continued reading. "A's for Helen's biological children, Lizzie, Emily, and Jonathan. Each of you will receive a bequest of $4,000. The silence shattered instantly. 4,000. Lizzie's voice cracked, high and furious. "That's an insult. She spent more than that on a single handbag." Jonathan slammed his fist against the table so hard the water glasses rattled. "She lost her mind before she died. That's the only possible explanation." Emily leaned forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is your fault." She spat directly at me. "She despised you for years. And now, suddenly, you get everything. What exactly did you do to her, Anna?" I sat frozen, staring down at the polished mahogany table, my heart pounding loudly in my ears. I wanted desperately to explain that I had no idea, that I was every bit as blindsided as they were. But the truth, painfully, was exactly that. I genuinely didn't understand why Helen had chosen me. When the meeting finally concluded, I walked out without saying a single word. Lizzie was still shouting behind me, her voice echoing sharply down the corridor. Emily refused even to glance in my direction, still glued protectively to her phone. Jonathan muttered curses under his breath as I passed him, his glare stabbing into me like small, sharp daggers. Outside, the cool afternoon air hit my face like a slap. I inhaled deeply, though it did little to calm my racing pulse. Without fully deciding to, I found myself driving directly toward Lakeview Drive. I had always known, distantly, that Helen owned a house somewhere along Lakeview Drive. But knowing and actually seeing, I quickly discovered, were two entirely different experiences. As I pulled up to the wrought iron gates, my breath caught sharply in my throat. The mansion rose before me, its tall windows blazing gold in the late afternoon sunlight. Ivy curled gracefully up the pale stone walls, and a wide, welcoming porch stretched across the front of the house, like something pulled directly from a dream I'd never imagined belonged to me. This is mine," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly, as though the entire scene might vanish the moment I let go. The gates creaked open at the press of a small, remote Mr. Adams had given me earlier. My car rolled slowly up the gravel drive, crunching softly beneath the tires, until I finally stopped before the massive front doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and lavender polish, almost as though Helen herself had simply stepped out moments earlier after tidying up. A grand staircase curved gracefully upward, its polished banister gleaming softly in the afternoon light. My footsteps echoed through the vast, quiet rooms as I wandered slowly from space to space. Everything sat immaculate, carefully arranged, yet somehow heavy with an invisible, unspoken weight. I had never lived here. I had never even visited. And yet, impossibly, it was now entirely mine. Drawn by some instinct I couldn't fully name, I eventually found myself standing before Helen's private study. A room that had always, throughout my childhood, remained strictly forbidden, a space no one dared enter uninvited. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Sunlight slanted gently across an antique desk, catching briefly on something small and pale resting near its center. A sealed envelope. My name was written carefully across the front, in Helen's elegant, unmistakable handwriting. My hands trembled as I reached for that envelope. My throat tightened painfully as I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter tucked inside. Her words stared back at me from the page. "Dear Anna, if you are reading this, then my time has passed." I read every line slowly, my heart thudding harder with each passing sentence. She wrote honestly about her own children's growing distance from her over the years, their apparent hunger for money, rather than genuine connection. She admitted, with striking candor, her own failures, the emotional coldness I had carried silently within me for decades. She confessed deep, genuine regret. And then, carefully, she turned her attention toward me. "You were quiet, excluded, yet remarkably resilient. I admired you for that. More than you ever knew. Leaving you this house isn't about the money itself. It's about giving you something I denied you when you were younger. A place where you truly belong." By the time I reached the final line, my vision blurred completely with tears. My chest heaved with sobs I hadn't realized, until that very moment, I'd been quietly holding inside for decades. For so long, I had believed Helen never truly saw me, that I'd existed as nothing more than a shadow lingering at the edge of her family's perfect portrait. But she had seen me, after all. Perhaps far too late to change the painful years that had already passed. But she had seen me. Of course, her children saw the situation very differently. Within days, Lizzie had plastered social media with furious, public accusations. She manipulated our mother. She typed in aggressive capital letters, gathering sympathy from distant acquaintances who knew nothing of our actual family history. Emily whispered similar accusations quietly to cousins and aunts, carefully painting me as a calculating schemer who had preyed upon a grieving, vulnerable widow. Jonathan called Mr. Adams' office repeatedly, vowing loudly to contest the will entirely. "She doesn't deserve that house," he shouted furiously during one particularly heated voicemail. "We'll fight this until it's completely overturned." But Mr. Adams reassured me calmly and repeatedly. The will, he explained, had been carefully, thoroughly prepared, legally airtight in every meaningful sense. The house was, without question, legitimately mine. Still, late at night, I often found myself standing quietly at the study window, gazing out over the dark, still lake beyond. The moonlight shimmered gently across the water's calm surface. I pressed my palms softly against the cool glass, whispering Helen's words aloud into the silence. "A place where you belong." And for the first time in decades, I finally allowed myself to believe her completely. In the weeks that followed, the storm around me only intensified. Lizzie filled my email inbox with venomous messages. "You don't deserve that house. You were nothing to her. Give us what's rightfully ours," she wrote repeatedly, her messages dripping with barely contained rage and entitlement. Jonathan showed up one evening at the property, pounding furiously against the iron gates, until his knuckles left visible red marks. His angry shouts echoed through the quiet neighborhood until concerned neighbors eventually called security to escort him away. Emily, meanwhile, continued painting me as the villain in every conversation she could manage. She tricked our mother. She hissed repeatedly to relatives, friends, even complete strangers. She preyed on her when she was weak and vulnerable. I want to pause here, because I think it's important to clarify something about what revenge genuinely meant within this particular story. I never sought public confrontation or vindication against Helen's children. I didn't defend myself loudly on social media or attempt to publicly correct their increasingly bitter accusations. I simply allowed Helen's own carefully written words and her carefully considered legal decisions to stand entirely on their own merit. At first, their bitterness stung sharply. Each fresh accusation burrowed uncomfortably into my chest. I lay awake many nights, replaying old memories, searching desperately for some hidden explanation. Had Helen truly meant for me to have this inheritance? Or was I simply the accidental beneficiary of some strange, cruel twist of fate? But every night, I found myself returning quietly to her study, to the letter that remained folded neatly in the top drawer of her desk, patiently waiting for me each time. Reading her words, again and again, anchored me firmly against the storms swirling furiously around me. You belong. 3 simple words. Words I had desperately needed throughout my entire painful childhood. I didn't flaunt my unexpected inheritance. I didn't purchase flashy new cars or drape myself in expensive designer clothing. Instead, I continued living exactly as I always had, simply, modestly, gratefully. The mansion itself was never truly about wealth for me. It was about healing. I transformed one of the mansion's upstairs rooms into a cozy library, gradually filling its empty shelves with books I had once only ever borrowed or quietly dreamed of owning outright. On quiet weekends, I began cooking modest dinners for close friends, nothing extravagant. Simply warm meals and genuine laughter echoing softly through halls that had once known only cold, heavy silence. For the first time in the house's long history, those walls finally held genuine joy. Eventually, Helen's children stopped fighting so fiercely. Mr. Adams had made it repeatedly, unmistakably clear, the will remained entirely unshakable. Their inheritance would stand exactly as Helen had chosen, $4,000 each, nothing more. At first, I assumed this modest inheritance had been intended purely as punishment. But the longer I reflected, the more clearly I understood it as something else entirely, a final, carefully considered message. Helen, it seemed, had wanted her children to learn, however painfully, exactly what genuine love without money actually looked like. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sat quietly beside the lake, with Helen's letter resting gently in my lap, moonlight painting the water's surface a soft, gleaming silver. I thought often of my father, the man who had originally asked Helen to look after me, all those years ago. She had admitted, in her own words, that she had failed both of us in different ways. But in her final act, it seemed, she had tried sincerely to make things right. I would never fully know whether Helen and I could have grown closer during her lifetime. But in death, she had given me something precious that I had quietly craved since I was 10 years old, sitting alone at the edge of an unfamiliar dinner table. Acknowledgement, genuine regret, and perhaps in her own deeply flawed way, something resembling love. Her mansion, though worth millions of dollars, was never truly the real inheritance. The genuine gift, the one I had silently craved since childhood, was something far simpler and infinitely more valuable: belonging. One quiet evening, as I carefully tucked Helen's letter back into its drawer, my husband appeared gently in the study doorway, watching me with quiet, patient concern. "You still read it every night," he said softly. I nodded slowly, my fingers lingering tenderly over Helen's elegant handwriting. "Because every time I do," I said quietly, "I believe her words a little more." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms gently around me, and for a long, peaceful moment, We simply stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by walls that had finally, after decades of quiet coldness, learned how to hold warmth. I think often about that quiet study, sunlight slanting gently across an antique desk, catching softly on a small, sealed envelope that would ultimately change everything I understood about my own painful history. For most of my life, I believed Helen had never truly seen me, that I had existed, invisibly, at the edges of a family portrait I never quite belonged within. I carried that quiet, persistent belief with me for decades, long after I'd physically left that painful chapter behind. But Helen's final letter taught me something profoundly important, something I carry with me still. Sometimes, people who fail us during their lifetime still carry genuine regret, genuine awareness, buried quietly beneath layers of complicated circumstance and painful family dynamics. And sometimes, healing doesn't arrive through confrontation or dramatic reconciliation. Sometimes, it simply arrives quietly, unexpectedly, through acknowledgement offered far too late to undo old wounds, yet still profoundly meaningful nonetheless. If you've ever felt invisible within your own family, overlooked in favor of louder, more celebrated siblings or step-siblings, I hope this story offers you something important. Your quiet resilience, even when unacknowledged for years, is never wasted. Recognition may not always arrive when you desperately need it most. But sometimes, when it finally does arrive, however late, it carries a weight and meaning that can genuinely reshape how you understand your own worth. And sometimes, real inheritance has nothing to do with money at all. Sometimes, it's simply about finally, unmistakably, being seen. That's the lesson I want to leave you with today. Because the most valuable thing anyone can ever leave behind isn't wealth, or property, or carefully worded legal documents. It's the simple, profound acknowledgement that you were always worthy of belonging, exactly as you are. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of being seen, acknowledged, and valued within your own family, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And remember, the next time you feel invisible, overlooked, or unworthy of genuine belonging, your quiet resilience matters more than you may ever fully realize. Sometimes, recognition simply takes time to find its way home. This story is inspired by real experiences. We believe every story carries a lesson that can bring light to others. To protect everyone's privacy, names, locations, and certain details have been changed while keeping the heart of the story true. If this story moved you, please like it, share it with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to Calm Girl Stories for more. Thanks for watching.